Could you tell us about the system of education imposed by Canada and how it affected the Anishinaabe of the Sault Ste. Marie area?
The government imposed education starts really with the Indian Act. Prior to that, so the Indian Act is 1876. Prior to that, as the story goes, Shinwalk trekked all the way to York and asked for a teacher. We got a missionary without a teaching certificate. So he was up here. That was McMurray. Well, actually, it was a different guy, but McMurray came up and taught people basic English skills, taught about Christianity. Then you get other missionaries coming up to do the same thing. On the American side of the river, Reverend Bingham is running a boarding and day school that people on the North Shore went to. It's hard to avoid saying Sioux Canada, Sioux Michigan, Sioux Anishinaabe. We're Anishinaabe, and both sides of the river are our home. So forgive me if I lapse. It's a bad habit that you pick up growing here. But people on the north side of the river went to Bingham's school too. And in the early years, education was seen as a way of learning how to read and do math to keep the traders and other people from cheating us. So education, even when the schools were imposed and there was an imposition by the government, it was seen as important, at least in terms of basic literacy in math and English and some history of who these other people are. It's nothing like learning about your trading partners, right? We do that today with globalization and education. But what happened is when the government imposes education, it was always there. The idea was to assimilate. But when you're invited to a community, it's harder to impose that agenda. But when the government of Canada takes over, they begin to take control of the day schools. Residential schools are created. The government of Canada doesn't really take over the one in Sault Ste. Marie to the 1890s. But what happens is when you get imposed schooling, you get an imposed curriculum where assimilation, incorporation in Canadian society is the mandatory. So what happens is parents lose control of their children in many ways and control of what the education is. Because today parents and the school board, if they go to the school board and complain enough, the school board will change as much as possible. You can go to the government and change it. But under the Indian Act, you could complain all you wanted and it was irrelevant, right? And what that does is the imposition of the English language. It's an attack on our culture, as we all know. It also is an attack on the sovereignty of our governance, because now anytime we have an agreement between ourselves, between the government of Canada, it's in English. It's their language. They control the words. They control the meaning. The meanings are in the Oxford English Dictionary. If our governments function in the Anishinaabe, how do they know it's much harder for them to figure out what's going on. We control the meaning of the words that are spoken, right? So it's not only an attack on the culture and how beliefs and other things are passed, it's also an attack on the governance systems, because you can't keep your government outside of, right? They need to hire translators, et cetera. We would control the meaning. Think of the treaty if it was an Anishinaabe. They'd have to come to us to ask us what it meant, not us going to them to get them to tell us what it means in their language, or hiring lawyers that speak, you know how it goes. So you get that, you get undermining of community, particularly for the people who went to residential schools. There's a break in bonds of family. You don't see your parents for months on end, or very limitedly, depending. You get brothers and sisters barred from talking to one another within the schools. The day schools aren't that much better, because there is separate education imposed in those things as well between boys and girls. The difference is you kind of got to go home at night. But from what I've been hearing from people is that is a minimal offset, because in class, whether it's day school or residential school, you're still told that everything your parents taught you to believe in is a lie or a funny little story, right? Nana Buju is a myth. The Bible's the truth, right? Our star charts aren't taught, right? So it becomes very much Eurocentric, very much about assimilation, and it really starts to undermine our independence, our sovereignty, our cultures, our ways of lives, and that's what you get when the government takes control. It's all about undermining us.
Could you tell us about the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and what it meant for the Anishinaabe of Wadding?
Well, the Royal Proclamation is a document that's solely issued by the King and Parliament of England, right? Technically, as Anishinaabe, we had no input into it. It's an imposed declaration. The idea behind it was the government in England and the Crown wanted to set up a means of governing its new colonies that had just won in the 7 Years' War, so Quebec, East and West Florida, and some islands in the Caribbean, as well as a way to manage and mitigate dealings with First Nations. The Americans, men like George Washington, were dealing illegally in Aboriginal lands, causing all sorts of issues. And frontier wars are notoriously expensive for the empire. And the British were, at all means, wanting to avoid that. Now, the reason they created the proclamation was to avoid frontier wars. Why they were scared of frontier wars is the Anishinaabe and our allies, the Shawnee, Chickasaw, Choctaws, Delawares, or the other big players, had basically imposed a border between white settlement and our peoples in the interior, and we drew a line, and basically a line in the forest, and said this is our lands. And the British, knowing that the settlers wanted those lands, and knowing that they'd be involved in great expense in dealing with us, especially through the idea of a war of conquest, essentially decided that based on our forceful resistance and our entreaties to them saying this is our land, pass this to try and regulate settlement. So, it was really our actions that forced them to issue that document. Now, what it meant for people in Sault Ste. Marie, it meant that the government or the Crown would have to negotiate treaties with us. It also has a lot of things it doesn't say. It can be argued it's an unofficial recognition of our government systems, because how do you negotiate a treaty with people that have no government, right? It separated us from subjects, so we weren't subject to the Crown, which in one way leads to many bad things, because if you're not subjects, do you have the same rights as subjects, right? Because the invention of citizenship in Canada doesn't occur till 1949, I think. So what are we? We're not subjects. Well, what are we? Well, we're under the government's control, possibly, but so there's issues there. What really means more to us than the proclamation sets out precedents. It's in the Constitution of Canada, and it's been described as a Magna Carta of Aboriginal rights because of what it does contain and what it doesn't contain. But the interesting thing is that I think the 1764 Treaty of Niagara is much more important for us in the long run, but the Government of Canada does not recognize that document.
Okay. Could you tell us about the Treaty of Niagara in 1764 and what it meant to the Anishinaabe of
Nice
Wadding?
segue. Well, the Treaty of Niagara, around about 2,000 Indigenous leaders showed up to that, right, making it one of the largest treaties in the history of treaty making in the world. The only other big one is, the other next biggest one, I believe, is the Great Peace of Montreal, 1701. Both of these treaties, the Anishinaabe of the Sioux played a role in. But in terms of the 1764 treaty, what happens is that's where we meet at Niagara and agree to end the conflict with the British. Because the French gave up fighting in 1760, France surrendered its colony in Canada to the English in 1763, but we really didn't stop fighting. We had not made a peace. Now, the British and their government assumed we'd made peace with them. They assumed this proclamation meant they'd have peace, but much to their consternation, their settlers and soldiers were still being killed. We still wouldn't behave as the good little people we were supposed to. So they sent, Johnston was ordered to make peace, to end the conflict. And to do this, he sent out copies of the Royal Proclamation with wampum to all the communities throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio valleys, and asked everybody to come to Niagara in the summer. So the 1763 arrived in the fall, the proclamation, he sent it out and said, we're going to have a treaty, we're going to have a conference at Niagara, Fort Niagara, in 1764, the summer. And that's on the American side, and over 2,000 leaders showed up. And there, and it's recorded in wampum. Nice belt with two people holding hands, council fires, and a date on it. So it's a very hybrid belt, because we didn't generally put dates on things. It's Europeans. But there we agreed to live in peace. We agreed to trade. We agreed that we could share our lands, provided things were met and conditions were dealt with. It was our acceptance of the Royal Proclamation, sort of, but there was other things added in. Sault Ste. Marie, the people in Sault Ste. Marie were offered to hold on to the other end of the wampum belt in 1764, recognizing that this was an honor. Our leadership decided to pass the honor to the people at Mackinac Island, the Odawa there, and said, you guys really need to hold on to the other end of this belt to make sure that it's maintained and enforced and followed. But I think that's the more important document, because it's really our acceptance of certain terms and our establishment of a more appropriate relationship with the British. Because we sat there and discussed it and agreed to it. It wasn't some king saying this is what we're going to do.
Could you tell us about the Jay Treaty of 1794 and what the border between British Canada and the United States meant for the Anishinaabe of Boating?
Yeah. The Jay Treaty. Oh, that lovely document. The Jay Treaty essentially forced Great Britain out of the interior posts. They agreed that the posts, such as the one at Mackinac, the one at Detroit, and others, would actually be allowed to be turned over to the Americans. The British had occupied these posts since the end of the American Revolution for a variety of reasons, mainly because they were too afraid to abandon them, figuring we would kill them or declare war on them, as the Anishinaabe. So they held on to the posts. But an incident forced the British hand, and they agreed, once the Americans did a few things, to turn the posts over to them and pull back to the north shores of the to the north shores of the lakes. And within that document, between these two between the American power and this European power, they agreed that Indians could cross the border without being molested and free of imports. So in that terms, what that supposedly gives us is the right to cross the border freely without being harassed at customs, without being, charged duties, taxes, etc. Problem is the War of 1812 broke out, which sort of ended that treaty, because by custom, when you declare war, all your treaties beforehand become invalid. The end of that war in 1814, supposedly the treaty was reactivated, because the treaty in 1814 between Britain and the States said everything gets restored to the way it was before the war. We'll just pretend this didn't happen, right? Sweep it under the rug type thing. And what's interesting is that in the United States and Canada both have different interpretations of this document. Canada interprets it as invalid, because no legislation was ever passed to recreate it, et cetera, et cetera. The Americans say it exists, but only if it's for people who are 50% blood of any one tribe. So you can be 100% Indian, but if you're 10% Cree, 10% Anishinaabe, 20% Blackfoot, 40% Mohawk, the numbers don't, you aren't 50% Mohawk, well, you don't qualify under this right. And that's sort of the two governments' positions. For us, it means that we have a border crossing right. We firmly believe that. Unfortunately, the governments don't believe that. There's a case, I think it's 2011, the Mitchell case, where the Mohawks went to court with some pretty flimsy evidence and blew it. They blew it because the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the government of Canada has the right to impose border controls, charge duties, et cetera, et cetera. We do not have the right of this free crossing and trade. And I say they blew it because I talk about this in my research. When you look at the treaties signed in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, with the Anishinaabe, people that the British government said were British Indians and people that the American government said were American Indians signed treaties on either side of the border. So the British authorities knew that they had what were considered American Indians signing this British treaty, which isn't, under international rules, isn't supposed to take place. There's a treaty in the States in 1855 where it recognizes that Garden River has rights in the U.S. Conveniently not mentioning Garden Rivers in British North America, it just kind of says that we have rights in the United States. which makes, I argue, 1850 a better document if we had to. We have to volunteer to get somebody arrested, though, as a court case to go forward to create a right, or have a right, not create a right, it's the wrong word, to have the rights officially recognized to stop the harassment at the border of our people. But the problem with that is you got to get somebody to get arrested to get into court. You know, if you want to volunteer for that, you know, it's a good thing, but expect to have 20 years of your life in and out of courts.
Well, thank you.
Could you tell us about the Mica Bay mine takeover?
Yes, the Mica Bay mine takeover in 1849 is the way it works in Canadian history. Everything north of Barrie until you hit Winnipeg doesn't really exist in a lot of Canadian history. You know, like they just kind of skip this area. So when you're in university, you very rarely, if ever, hear about 1849. You very rarely, if ever, hear about 1850 or anything along the North Shore. I mean, they don't even talk about the discovery of nickel in Sudbury and how big of an industrial input for Ontario Sudbury becomes, never mind anything else. It goes from Barrie to Red River. Now, that being said, 1849, the Mica Bay Incidents, a very important watershed moment for the history of Canada, because what it does is, in taking over the mine, Shinwakons, Nebnegojing, Oshawano, and their supporters, Métis and Anishinaabe, forced the government of Upper Canada to negotiate a treaty. The government of Upper Canada, based on various reports of Indian agents, land speculators, and others, were trying to argue that no treaties were necessary anymore, which was a violation of 1763. And if they'd gotten away with it, the whole treaty issue, I would argue, and may have been a dead point from that point forward, but they didn't. We forced their hand. We took over the mine, took some cannons from Sioux Canada, got a bunch of gunpowder off a French-Canadian fur trader, Peter Barbeau, borrowed one of his boats, and went up to Mica Bay, attempted to make a deal with the mine manager that he could continue to operate, provided that they basically pay us revenues and taxes on everything they ship out. He refused, so some American ships unloaded the miners and took them down here to Sault Ste. Marie, mainly to the American side, where they got into the American rail system and rail and boating system, and they managed to make it to southern Ontario. Southern Ontario, and even newspapers in Detroit, yelled and screamed about an Indian massacre and Indian violence on the frontier, which prompted the Canadian and British governments to send soldiers up here. Right? Soldiers showed up at Mica Bay. A few of them maybe got there. There's no real evidence they did or didn't get there. But if so, they'd have got there in December, kind of miserable, turned around, came back here. Shinwakons, Nebnegojing, and a few others got arrested for their activities because supposedly what they did was illegal. They were charged. The initial set of charges were dismissed, and they were recharged. And in the process, they were released on promised good behavior, sent back up here to negotiated a treaty, and once the treaty was negotiated, their crimes were then forgiven by the governor, lieutenant governor. And I always question, were they told you had to negotiate a treaty or go to jail? Or if they weren't told that, what would have happened to these men if they just said, no, this treaty sucks, we're not negotiating it, this is our land? Would they have been rearrested? Right? So Mica Bay, really, I argue it's a watershed moment for Canada, and it's like I say, it's generally ignored because it forced the issue in 1849 of treaties. Because no other treaties had really, there was treaties signed by Lieutenant Governor Bondhead and those guys, but there was this argument that further treaties weren't necessary. There was an argument that every Indian on the North Shore was actually an American Indian that moved up here, either from the Mississippi thousands of years ago or more recently, depending who wrote or argued these things. And they really didn't want to do treaties. And they forced their hand, and the 1850 treaty serves really as a groundwork treaty for all the numbered treaties in Western Canada. So if you ever pick up a book on like treaty number 7, treaty number 8 or whatever, there's always a few paragraphs or a few pages on 1850. Because our treaty set the precedent and set the format for all the treaties out west. And so 1849 is this watershed moment, and it could have went one way or the other. And it was done under the threat of violence, but it was done rather peacefully because nobody died.